So I just want to talk a little bit about what happened after Jesus came into Jerusalem. And I don't think we've got Shane, have we? Can't see him. No, so I'm going to read this little bit, which happens after Jesus has entered Jerusalem, after he's cleared the temple, and he's argued with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they've given him tricky questions, and he's managed to answer them all, or avoid them if he needed to. He's done all sorts of things in this time. It's not just a week, it's a bit longer than a week. He's cursed a fig tree, he's cleared the temple courts of money changers, and he's caused a great deal of trouble. And in the evenings, he went back, it looks like every evening pretty well, to Bethany, which is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. And he would stay the night in Bethany. And this is where this bit, Mark chapter 14, this bit is set. And it's sometime between Jesus is coming into Jerusalem on a donkey and the Passover, when we remember that on Good Friday. So it's Mark chapter 14, starting at verse 1. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me." She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. So that's Mark's Gospel's account of this special meal in Bethany. Now, I wonder if you've ever been in a room where everybody is looking at you. And sometimes it's nice, like when Nikki and I got married, everybody was looking at us. And that was fine, because they all had kind thoughts towards us. And we felt the love, we did. But sometimes you're in a place and everybody's looking at you and they're thinking nasty thoughts. You might have made an embarrassing mistake, or you've done something that everybody disapproves of or something, and everybody's looking at you and everybody's thinking nasty thoughts about you. And I wonder who you relate to in this story. So Jesus isn't sitting down to eat, he's reclining at a table, because that's what they did in those days. He's been invited by somebody who's probably fairly rich, because they can afford to feed him and his disciples and a few other people too. They're in Bethany, which is a town, the name means house of the poor. So it's probably a relatively poor place, although this man seems to be quite rich. He's called Simon the leper. He can't be a leper anymore, so maybe Jesus healed him. We just don't know. But what we do know is that Martha, Jesus' friend Martha, is serving at the table, that Lazarus is sitting there with him, because this is in John's Gospel as well, and it tells us about this feast in another passage in John's Gospel. And if you remember, there's Martha and there's Lazarus, and then there's Martha and Lazarus' sister called Mary. It's almost certainly not Mary Magdalene, it's Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And she comes in and makes an exhibition of herself. That's what seems to happen. She disrupts everything. She comes in and she takes a jar of this really, really expensive perfume. And what you would normally do is something as expensive as this. It's worth maybe, in today's money, 10 or 15,000 pounds, this jar of perfume. You would very carefully remove the lid every time you used it and just use a few drops, tiny drops each time, and then carefully put the lid back on that bottle. And the alabaster jar itself is really expensive. You can't get an alabaster jar easily because it's made out of solid stone and people have to hollow it out to make it so that it will safely store whatever's inside it, because stone won't let the perfume escape out of the side, whereas clay pots might do that. So this alabaster jar itself is expensive, and the contents have come all the way from India. It's a root which is found high up in the Himalayas. It's taken to expert perfumers in somewhere like Egypt or Persia and made into perfume and put into alabaster jars and then sent on and sold. And this would be the most expensive thing, almost certainly, that Mary could possibly have owned. We don't know where she got it from. And she could have sold it for nearly a year's worth of wages. And yet what she does is, instead of taking the stopper out and giving a little bit, she breaks the jar and pours it out over Jesus' head. And in John's Gospel we find out she puts it on his feet as well, and she wipes them with her hair. And she shows this devotion to Jesus in this way. I wonder what you would have thought, because there's lots of people, including Judas, who thought this was a terrible waste. They said, why would you do this? Why would you pour all of this perfume away in one big gesture? Aren't you just showing off? Don't you just want everybody to look at you? Well, that's what we're doing, but we're not looking at you in a nice way. We're looking at you critically. All this money could have been given to the poor. That's what some people are thinking. Other people are thinking, well, Jesus has got this woman doing all this stuff to his head and his feet. What's going on there? And they're thinking unpleasant thoughts about Jesus as well. But Jesus doesn't think like either of those two people. I have to say, I'd probably be more like Judas. I'd have been thinking, yeah, that money could have been given to the poor. What a waste. That would have probably been me. And I would have been just like Judas, which isn't a good place to be, really, is it? But Jesus isn't like that at all. If I'd been Jesus, I would have probably thought, I want to show that I don't really approve of this, and this is all a bit kind of, she's doing this, but it's not me. I'm not involved in this. But Jesus doesn't do that either. Those people who say bad things about her, Jesus rebukes them. He says, no, she's done a wonderful thing for me. She's prepared my body for burial. And then Jesus does what most of us wouldn't do, because we're not him. He said, you won't always have me with you, but you'll always have the poor. Because actually Jesus knew who he was, that he was actually worthy of worship in himself, because he was God's. He's God's Son, part of the Trinity. He's God, and he's worthy of that worship. He says, you won't always have me with you, but you will always have the poor. This is an opportunity which Mary has correctly seen. She's seen that this is something important, and she's acted upon it. And he accepts it as worship. And God loves true worship that's extravagant. Not us showing off to other people how much we love God. That's not it. It's about us showing God wholeheartedly what's in our hearts. He just loves to see that. it reminded me a little bit, this extravagance was C.T. Studd, who went to China as a missionary and then went to Africa later. He was 23 years old and he was heir to a load of money and possessions. And he was in China, in a place where very few Westerners were, and he got letters from London saying, you have inherited all these thousands and thousands of pounds. It would have been millions in today's terms. And he'd just been reading about the rich young man who needed to give up all his wealth. And he said, I want to turn this down, but I need a witness. And the only other person who was Western around him was the British consul. He went to the consul and he said, I want to turn this down, I want to sign it. And the consul said, no, you don't know what you're doing. You're being foolish. Don't do this. And he insisted on it. And he said, well, I'll give you 2 weeks. And if you still want to do it in 2 weeks' time, then I'll witness this rejection of this inheritance. And 2 weeks' time, C.T. Studd went back. And that's what he did. He gave up all his wealth because he believed that that's what God was telling him to do with his money. God sometimes whispers to us about extravagance and worship, and it's delightful to God when we respond. So, I wonder, just for us today, are we the sort of people who help people to be accepted like Jesus did? Do we stand up for people in a crowd when everyone else is disapproving? Do we stick up for people, or do we go along with the bullies? Some of us know what it's like to be bullied and picked on. Some of us know what it's like to worry about what people might think of us and whether we'll be bullied along with those other people. Do we stick up for them, or do we not? Jesus sticks up for people. Do we put money and practicality before our adoration of Jesus? Would we be there saying, oh, this money is just being wasted and it's irresponsible extravagance? Would we be like that? That's probably, as I said, where I would be. And I wonder if Jesus, the coming King, is calling any of us to that sort of extravagance this morning. He doesn't call it everybody, and he takes his time, but there may be an extravagance in worship that Jesus is calling one or two of us to this morning. I think all of us can be extravagant in our expression of worship, and it's quite nice in the sense on Zoom because you know that nobody else is looking at what you're doing. You can just get on with your worship however you want to. You know that you're not showing off to other people because they can't see you. You're just there worshipping before God.